We are now in part B. So we're merging sections 1.4, 1.5 into together, and the overall arching discussion is regarding slope. So to recap, remember when at last we saw each other, we had learned about the point slope form of an equation, which basically takes on the following form. But notice that, for example, that example 2 and example 3, the last part of each one of those questions asked us to solve for y, to get y by itself. So I want to give that form of an equation a name as well. So when you solve a linear equation for y, we refer to this as the slope-intercept form of the equation. All right. At the end of, in just a little bit, I'll come back and I'll try to make sure you understand why you would have all of these different forms of the equation for line in a line, right? Why sometimes you solve for y, sometimes you don't, stuff like this. So let me first though, let's discuss horizontal and vertical lines. So take the equation y equals -4. Now let's assume that your goal was to graph that. How would you know it's a line, but you want to graph y equals -4? How would you do it? Well, first off, let's, so we have our y-axis running vertical, our x-axis running here. And if my eyesight is doing me justice, then right here would be when y is equal to -4. But wait a minute, if y always equals -4, right? If x is 0, y is -4. If x is 10, y is -4. If x is -10, y is -4. If you start to connect these dots, you see how a horizontal line forms, right? So when you graph y equals -4, oh, that's probably the worst graph in history. Try that again. Still horrible. That's okay. You have to deal with it. Good enough. So when you graph y equals -4, what you get is a horizontal line. Now, let's do the same thing with x equals 2. And then we're going to talk about the slopes of horizontal and vertical lines. So if you wanted to graph x equals 2, well, okay, well, here is where x is equal to 2. And guess what? No matter what y is, x is going to stay where it's at. So if if y is 5, x is still 2. If y is -5, x is still 2. And when you start to connect these dots, what you see is a vertical line is formed. So this is the graph of x equals 2. So what's the takeaway? Well, the takeaway is, how about this? How about the super informal? If you're missing one of your variables, like this equation's missing the x, this equation's missing the y. If you're missing one of the variables, how about your mindset is it's going to be either a vertical or a horizontal line. How's that? And if you have y equals, it's horizontal. If you have x equals, it's vertical. Now let's actually talk a little bit about the slopes of horizontal and vertical lines. Okay, so let's start with horizontal. Well, think about you know, if you were going to use your slope formula, what do you need? You need 2 points, right? So if I just randomly, looking at this equation, if I randomly just choose 2 different points, I'll just pick these 2 right here. So I'll choose this point, and I'll choose this point. Now, if I were, let me label those, so let's go ahead and label these 2 points. Well, the first point, x is at 0, and what is y? Well, it's at -4, right? It's always at -4 for this line. The second point, x is now at 5, and what's y? Well, it's -4. So watch what happens if I take these 2 points and plug them into my slope formula. I end up with m is equal to, ready? Let's go ahead and plug everything in. So y sub 2 is -4 minus, what is y sub 1? It's also -4. And then you have x sub 2, which is 5, and minus x sub 1, which is 0. You end up with -4 plus 4 over 5, or 0 over 5. Now, 0 divided by 5 is just 0. So we now get to make the statement that, or we're going to make the statement, that horizontal lines have a slope of 0. Something that makes perfect sense, that, right? There's no steepness here. It's not inclined at all. So horizontal lines have a slope of 0. Let's do the same thing. We'll go quickly with vertical lines. I'm going to just pick 2 points here. So we'll just say this point, and we'll grab this point as well. So x is 2 in both of these, but y is 0 and y is 5. All right, doesn't matter what we call x1, y1, x2, y2, so we'll just go quickly here. We'll say this is x1, y1, x2, y2. Ready? Now let's plug everything into the slope formula. So that we're going to end up with y sub 2 is 5 minus y sub 1, which is 0, divided by x sub 2, which is 2, minus x sub 1, which is 2. So we end up with 5 over 0. Now, 0 divided by 5 is a perfectly legit operation. But 5 divided by 0 makes absolutely no sense. If you told me, if I had 5 slices of pizza, and you said, hey, I'm not going to eat any, I want 0 of the 5 slices, I can understand exactly what you mean. But if I have 0 slices of pizza, and you tell me, hey, I want to eat all 5 of those 0 slices, I have no idea what you're talking about. So the division by 0 is undefined. So that means, or what we're going to, the statement that we're going to make is all vertical lines have an undefined slope. To talk about, this if you were standing here, you're looking up this, completely this completely vertical mountain or building. To talk about the slope makes no sense. So we can't divide by 0. Let me do this, because I'm gonna erase the things that I have here, and I want to talk about this division of 0 for just a second. Because what I found is, or at least from my experience, is when I was in middle school, high school, I would have my teachers would make statements like you can't divide by zero. Right? And if you were to ask why can't I divide by zero? The answers that at least that I got were you just can't. It's the rule. We make up the rules. You can't do it. And that's not exactly true. So will you grant me, will you indulge me for 60 seconds? And in 60 seconds, if someone ever asks you, why can't I divide by zero? In 60 seconds, if you listen to me, you'll be able to give them a legit answer. Ready? Let's go. So let's assume that, using that example over here, let's assume that you could divide by zero, right? 5 divided by 0 actually does equal something. Well, we don't know what it is, so when we don't know what it is, we normally call it x, right? So let's assume that you could do it. Well, that would mean by properties of equality. For example, if I had 1 over 2 equals x, you and I know I can multiply both sides of that equation by 2. So that ends up with 1 equals 2x, right? What if I did that here? What if I multiply both sides of this equation by 0? Well, that would end up with 5 is equal to x times 0. And what have we've always gone under the assumption that anything multiplied by 0 is 0, right? So 5 equals 0. So if you ask a mathematician, can I divide by 0? I want to do it. I really want to do it. Can I divide by 0? Well, a mathematician is going to, worth their salt, is going to say, sure, you can divide by 0 if you want. You just got to accept the consequences. Well, what are the consequences? Well, you would have to live in a world where there's no difference between 5 and 0. The law of identity is out the window. So you would have to start to throw away previous concepts. Now, if you're okay living in a world where if you have $5 in your pocket or you have $0 in your pocket, same thing, doesn't matter. 5 equals 0. If you're okay living in that world, then proceed to divide by 0. But if you want to maintain the law of identity, then we can't allow it. So you can't allow division by 0. I hope that helps. This is the last little bit of information from, this is really 1.4, and then we'll proceed to 1.5. So another way of writing the equation of a line is what we call the general form. And I haven't, at the bottom here, you can see all these different ways of writing the same thing. And I'll tell you why we have so many different ways of doing it and why it's useful. But right now, let's just make sure we understand. When I say general form, what I mean is that your equation is set equal to 0. Right? anything that you have is on the left side, and then all you have is 0 on the right side. So what is the question here? So it says our goal is to find the slope and the y-intercept of the following equation. So let's jump in and get started. So we got 3x plus 2y minus 4 is equal to 0. We have we have our two tasks. Let's call it A is find slope. And task B is y-intercept. Ready? Let's start with A. So unless you're very savvy with doing math in your head, it's really hard to look at this form of an equation and be able to just say what the slope is. But guess what? If you can get your equation to look like this, right? Then it's really easy to spot what the slope is. The slope is whatever's attached to x. So what we're going to do is we're going to take this equation and we're going to solve it for y. All right, so I'm not going to go through this baby algebra of, solving for y. The result would be y is equal to negative 3/2 x plus 2. Oh, so sorry. Negative 3/2 x plus 2. So, but once you have it solved for y, the slope is very easy to spot. Whatever is attached, the coefficient that is attached to x is your slope. So m is equal to 3/2. Guess what else is really easy to spot? The y-intercept. Now, we use this letter b, this variable b, to represent the y-intercept. So guess what? Once you've solved this equation for y, this is your y-intercept. So does that make sense that the y-intercept is going to be equal to 2, right? So 0, 2. So let's recap. So if you have 2 points and you want the slope, then this is the formula you want. Right, this is what we call the slope formula. Now, if you have a slope and a point and you want the equation of the line, this is your formula. You start here. All right, if you are like the previous problem, if you're trying to figure out what the slope of that line is or what the y-intercept of that line is, then you want this form right here, the slope-intercept. If you were trying to factor and solve for x, you would want this form, the general form. And finally, we didn't even discuss this one, but if all your variables are on one side and your constant is on the other side, we call that standard form. And this is a really good form if you're dealing with like systems of equations and you're trying to figure out if you have 2 lines and you want to know where they cross, where they intersect, this is a really good form to be in. So yeah, I agree with you. They're just different ways of saying the same thing, yet they have different purposes. They serve different goals. So let's go ahead and conclude, and we will start 1.5 in the next video.